Hello, very beautiful community. A few of you have asked me if Marco Rubio's speech at Munich was an anticipation of what I call the white identitarian politics to come in the 2030s. So we're going to look at that, and we're going to look at a few lines from Rubio, and then we're going to give ourselves an understanding of how that slide works and what to look out for, and at what point to be concerned, and at what point to be alarmed. Yesterday, when we chatted about Rubio's speech, I left this point out because I wanted to leave out the outrage at the anti-post-colonial nature of what Rubio said, which was quite widespread in parts of the internet. And I wanted to leave it out because I thought the political point was fundamental, that this is a guy really abusively communicating with citizens by handing them a bag of hot air, pretending that it's substantial. My problem as far as yesterday's chat was concerned wasn't that the endorsement of pre-World War II Western colonialism was a bad thing to do, but it was an empty thing to do. It's not a politics you can reconstitute, especially as the United States is in the form of the Trump administration, busy at work at dismantling its own state capacity. Ironically, I mean, this is why there is such a need to keep emphasizing the lack of substance in these authoritarian, democratically destructive post-truth political projects on the X-right. Because they're so full of hot air, there's so little substance, even substance you can disagree with. Because there's no way of reconstituting the imperialism of the past for the United States. And as the US is currently withdrawing from the world, depleting its state capacity, it's completely ludicrous for these people to talk about doing something that they are, in virtue of their own policies, making less doable. And of course, Rubio is a political entrepreneur who wouldn't be saying the things he's saying anyway if he weren't in the Trump administration. So that was the point I wanted to emphasize. You were being handed a bag of fake goods. But let's now talk about this other dimension, which I wanted to minimize yesterday, about what level of outrage we can have about Rubio's endorsement of anti-post-colonialism and whether that's at all tied to this slide or cascade toward white identitarianism to come in the 2030s. I've picked up a couple of quotes, and I've literally taken 5 seconds to do this, so I don't think any of my numbers are right, but I've given a score from 0 to 10, and 0, and perhaps 1 and 2 also, just a relatively clean bill of health as far as slide linguistically and conceptually toward this white identitarianism of the 30s goes. 10 is a very high score. It's a problematic framing for us that we should be on alert about. So let's rock and roll. Child Europe. For us Americans, our home may be in the Western Hemisphere, but we will always be a child of Europe, and I think that's relatively benign. Might be less benign in combination with all the other things. And then there is a civilization moment described in ancestral terms. We're bound to one another by the deepest bonds that nations could share, forged by centuries of shared history, Christian faith, culture, heritage, language, ancestry. Ancestry is an important word here, and because this doesn't, but slightly risks raising questions about, well, are all the citizens in our country included, if that's the formulation that we're putting forward? Because of that, I'm going to go for a 3, slightly higher than completely benign. Lineage language. The Europeans could never have imagined that 250 years later, one of their direct descendants would be back here today on this continent as the chief diplomat of that infant nation. Now, this is again borderline, just giving it a 3, because one might say, isn't it a bit sus that Rubio is playing down his Cuban heritage and tying himself to Europe. Well, originally, it may be right that he's tied to Spain and Italy. But it's an interesting move that is not saying I'm a proud Cuban. He has said that on many occasions, however, so I'm only going to give this a 3. But this line has been picked out about why he has chosen to frame his identity in one way rather than another. In the context of all the other things, that kind of framing begins to resonate with a modicum of discomfort. Mass migration as existential threat. Mass migration threatens the cohesion of our societies, the continuity of our culture, and the future of our people. And we want our allies to basically get this as well. We want them to be proud of their culture and their heritage. And we want allies who understand that we're heirs to the same great and noble civilization. Now, we do indeed have a crisis of legitimacy around mass migration, both at the level of so-called illegal migration and at the level of the numbers of legal migration. Many Western countries are facing a legitimacy crisis because most citizens feel we've lost control of this process. Who talks about it? I do. I think it's very important. It's very, very wrong to dismiss this as a right, an inappropriate, excessively right-wing talking point. But how do I talk about it? I talk about it in terms of a legitimacy crisis. People losing the confidence that their governments know what they're doing, losing the confidence that they themselves have a say in how the borders of their country work, losing confidence in whether the borders are controllable by anybody at all. And these are understandable sentiments that it would be politically disgraceful to dismiss as racism, even if you have a pro-immigration sensibility of a personal kind, whereby you wouldn't mind if the street was populated by a bunch of Syrian refugees because they're highly educated and they're very clever and they're going to make nice food and they're going to make nice friends, right? It doesn't matter how far that's your sort of culture, personally speaking. The problem is that you can't just translate that into a political position. And the political position needs to take heed of the fact that we have a massive crisis of trust around our immigration policy. But notice I don't say the continuity of our culture, the future of our people. So the issue isn't that there's a problem with mass migration, but the issue is that there's too much emphasis on civilization, cohesion, heritage in the way what's wrong with the mass migration issue is framed. So what have I given for that? I've gone 4. Anti-post-colonialism. For 5 centuries, the West has been expanding. Its missionaries, its pilgrims, its soldiers, its explorers built vast empires extending out across the globe. And I've gone 5 here because this is both silly and revisionist in many ways. And yesterday I ignored it because the bigger point here is just that this is BS. That's a bigger point than the fact that this is offensive. So if we are to score this purely on healthiness, it's going to get a slightly higher score in the negative direction of 5, because who were these people doing this imperialism? They were white Europeans. And essentially in his speech, Rubio said, goody, that's great. And opposition to that is a bunch of baloney and a communist conspiracy, rather than movements of national liberation. That may have themselves created all kinds of destructive politics, but nevertheless, they weren't just a communist conspiracy. So that is a sort of historically silly normalization of practices that we have challenges with. So we're going to go 5. Alignment with Orban, we're going to go 7. And so how does this work? Western civilization is great and needs to be defended. Well, I love that statement. I'm okay with it. Then we move to Western civilization is European in origin. Okay, we can be okay with that depending on how we frame it. So this is a slightly less stable statement than the first statement. Europeans are foundational. Here we're getting into more trouble. What are we going to say to all of our citizens who are not of European descent? And then we move to the real problem, which is foundational groups, being foundational groups, deserve priority. And that's how I invite you to judge, if you want to judge for yourself, Rubio's speech. How far down this escalator does he come? He certainly doesn't come all the way to the bottom. But is there a semblance of a creep toward the discourse that isn't yet our discourse, that isn't yet Rubio's discourse, of white identitarianism in the 2030s? Yeah, there is. So there is something unhealthy in his speech that gestures toward the extension of this historical trend, which luckily for us hasn't extended yet, but will in the next decade. I think that we have done ourselves a lot of damage with what I've called hyper-identity politics, because we overemphasized ethnicity and increasingly segmented group belonging and the specialness of increasingly segmented group belonging, such that politics around issues of that group belonging, according to some of us at least, engaged in hyper-identity politics, needed to be framed in not just political but moral terms, and not just moral terms but identity terms. That's very, very damaging, because it will give greater license to white identitarians in the 2030s to say, well, we're doing the same thing. And what do you want? We are the majority here. And that's why now it's very important to do something about how we advocate for structurally disadvantaged minorities. We've got to advocate for them strongly on the basis of solidarity and the public good and patriotism. The problem we've got is that if we keep advocating for structurally disadvantaged groups as though the old language of hyper-identity politics still worked, will actually do more damage to the rights of these groups than help them. So it's a very important, rather urgent readjustment, because currently we're stuck in a situation where if you're a Black American, you either get advocated for via hyper-identity politics, not in reference to solidarity and the public good, and that's counterproductive, or you get deprioritized by the building wave of ex-conservative authoritarianism. And you don't want to be in that predicament where there's one kind of language that just doesn't work any longer, does harm, and the only other kind of language you can reach for is exclusionary toward you. So we need quite a bit of hard work on a rather urgent realignment here. Otherwise, we're going to cascade from a normalization of the particularization of discourse about groups to a complete evaporation of the sense that we have groups that need to be advocated for because they are deprioritized. So it's a big challenge. So that's some of how the slide will happen. A very big trigger for the acceleration of this pattern will be the climate crisis. Already seeing significant climate impacts in Western countries themselves. We're going to see many more of those. And that will create a realignment we don't currently have, which is a not just a conservative backing for taking the climate crisis seriously, but ex-conservative backing for taking the climate seriously, because we're living through the death of conservatism as a political ideology. Temporary death at least. It can get resurrected in 100 years. So we're going to have basically exclusionary post-truth authoritarians going around saying, oh my God, the climate crisis is the number one issue we've got to face. That hasn't happened yet. They're still in the climate denial lane. And the biggest mistake that climate advocates make today is to think that Trumps and Orbans are going to stay in the climate denial camp. They won't. They'll move out of it, and the way they'll move out of it will make you realize that all the current talk about the eco-fascism that is supposedly everywhere is nonsense, because we haven't seen real eco-fascism yet, but we will in the 2030s. So we've got to get prepared for that slide. It'll be happening like water coming to the boil. We aren't there yet. So if Rubio came out and said, the fourth thing on this list, right, foundational groups deserve priority, we would all be freaked out beyond imagination. But we're slowly progressing toward, the disinhibition of that kind of statement. We're still already hearing that statement here and there, but it's not normalized. It's a central part of our discourse. It will be eventually. And we'll have debates about whether we should or shouldn't whether we should or shouldn't give extra priority to white people. That's scary, but that's where we're going to land. And we need tools to slow that down. And we also need tools to fight against it when we're there, because it's not as though we won't be able to make a difference. Of course we will. So that's basically my reaction to the question, was Rubio trending or not trending toward the white identitarianism to come in some of his framings. I've been a bit sick in this video with my health, so I've stumbled on a lot of words, and I'm especially grateful you've kept on with me through it. Lots of love talk very soon.